Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this episode of The Future Mind. Today, Alex will be in conversation with Kimberly Johnson. She is author, postpartum care activist, trauma educator, structural body worker, and mother. She is the author of Call of the Wild: How We Heal Trauma, Awaken Our Own Power, and Use It for Good, and The Fourth Trimester, a postpartum guide to healing your body, balancing your emotions, and restoring your vitality. She is the host of the Sex, Birth, Trauma podcast. And she's in conversation with Àlex Gómez-Marín, director of the PARI Center. He is a Spanish physicist turned neuroscientist. He holds a PhD in theoretical physics and a master's in biophysics from the University of Barcelona. In 2016, he has been the head of the Behavior of Organisms Laboratory in Alicante, where he is an associate professor of the Spanish Research Council. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Alex. Welcome.
Thank you, Eleanor, and welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Kimberly, for accepting our invitation. I really love talking to people like you, and that's one of the reasons why I'm delighted that we have this opportunity to kind of continue the conversations we have had, not many, but a few in private, to open it in public. And let me also say before we start that I'm realizing, after having done this many times, that there's maybe 2 or 3 dimensions to these kind of conversations. And in one of those dimensions, you want to talk about heavy, abstract, academic, difficult topics. But there's another axis where the topics are no less difficult, but much more concrete, not so abstract and embodied. And also the challenge to do that in a kind of a small circle feeling or setup where it really feels like we are a few people in an aura of trust where we can talk about difficult subjects and have our heads awaken, but also our hearts and the rest of the body. And so that's the challenge or the invitation for today, that we can do that, and being with you, I think it's going to make it happen. So where to begin? Perhaps talking about.
Let me ask you this first. So with that being your desire, there's, I think, something that can happen knowing that there's about 20 of us here. And then there's something else that happens if we think, okay, we're going to put this on YouTube afterwards. They're kind of different things with especially the recent things we talked about, and sexuality and intergenerational trauma. There's a way to, because I would consider myself quite transparent person, but I do work with a lot of clients, and I also, there's certain things about my own family life that I wouldn't share on YouTube just because I wouldn't have permission and to do that. So that might be a good parameter of how important is it for us to just really circle the people in who are here today and go in that direction, and how important is it that this conversation be available afterwards, and that might help us shape the depth that we can go. And it can be deep either way, but that direction of philosophical, I bridge those gaps through personal examples and through examples of people that I've worked with. So
I love that you're pausing me here, and we can decide actually, well, right now or in 30 minutes or in an hour, because that's really part of the challenge I've been discovering, sensing over the last sessions we've had. Because there are things that are intimate that I would like them to see the light of the public, but not just because it's nice to show them. Actually, it's not nice to show them, but how to make it so that they survive that light. And maybe there's a distinction between something that's private and something that's intimate. But we could certainly talk and just have this for us, and despite it being recorded, to decide that we won't and don't need to share it. And I'll be perfectly fine with this because, well, that's one of the reasons why we're doing it live too, because I like to know that there's people there. This is not just content production for the sake of it. It's actually it attempts to be a true conversation. So when it's finished, it's finished.
Yeah, I think this is a question of our time. So let me give you an example. Oftentimes when I lead a workshop or lead a gathering, I take my clothes off while I'm talking about certain things. I don't advertise that anywhere, and I ask the people that come not to tell that to other people widely, because I don't want people to come because of that, and I don't want people not to come because of that. I don't want that to become a fetishized thing of like, oh, this teacher takes her clothes off and teaches, let me go find out what that's about. It has something to do within the context.
You're suddenly muted. Sorry. Oh, I'm not listening. Is there an audio
Oh,
problem?
it's on her side though.
All right. Can you
Yeah, we
you
can't hear you anymore, Kimberly.
no, you're not
Oh,
muted, but we
it's
can
like breaking. It's like coming in and out.
Okay.
now. Yeah, now you're back.
Okay, hold on one second, because I know what happened, because I flashed a notice on the screen.
All right.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, we're good. Yeah, you were telling us as that
So I
example.
think it's
Yeah.
a big question of this time. You know, we had the Me Too movement, which encouraged people to en masse describe the abuses and the transgressions and the ways that the things that were brought up to the surface for them in hearing people. And a lot of that happened online. It didn't happen in small, intimate spaces. It didn't happen in places where we could really hear the when I say something, I hear your reflection back to me, or I'm sitting in a group where there's a container for it. And that was a great lament of mine, because having worked with so many people that have had sexual boundary transgressions, I was like, this isn't good. Like, I understand why people think it's good. I understand why people think this is important. And I'm not saying it wasn't important. I'm just saying that it was a partial step, and it was also happening in a culturally bereft time where we don't have ritual, we don't have ways that we gather, we don't have an agreed upon system of what apology looks like, what repair looks like, and how we do that. And so um, this is a micro investigation of how these kinds of things, like what really helps, what really moves something forward beyond a simple, because we live in a time where there's a prejudice towards vulnerability. Because I cry a lot, people always say, oh, thank you for your vulnerability. And I'm like, okay, well, this is just kind of who I am, and I get it, like, thank you, sure. But it's also because there's so much out there that's like the more vulnerable you are, the better it is. And you can reveal something one day, and then the next day you just put out another piece of content, and it just gets buried under everything else. And I don't want vulnerability to become currency, because I don't think that that actually helps with repair. So I don't say that I don't want a recording because of, I mean, partially it's respect for certain things, but it's also because it's a wondering about the 23 people that took the time out. I just was in that territory, literal territory, but also psychic territory for intensively for a while. And I, in order, as people came to me to solve them, so people come and they've got pain, or it could be physical, it could be emotional, It could be more making soon if I don't find a way to communicate with him about intimacy and about my body want. Maybe ever since X event, about my sense of self and my body has changed. And so to be with that is actually to wrestle one's sense of them knowing. So it's not ignoring their problem, walk them out of it, but generally so people come and they just want the internal work, signals at all that they would be, or that they would be comfortable there, and it would be another to just desire and go just right ahead plowing it. So there is a major piece of work that I did, and I mean, maybe I'll just back up a little bit. So the reason that I went to somatic experiencing school, which is where I learned about the nervous system and trauma, was that I was teaching a workshop in Thailand, and it was a yoga training workshop because I used to teach yoga. And 2 out of the 10 women went into body convulsions while we were doing a yoga practice, involuntary movement. And both of them told me privately that that had never happened for them other than in sex, except for in this class. I didn't know why it was happening. And then after I sat with them for a little bit, they told me that it started after a sexual boundary transgression. So one of them was getting came up on the table and assaulted her. And so after that, she sort of had this energetic fracture that was living in her body in spasm. But at that moment, I could be a very passionate witness, but I had no idea what it was about me that was making that happen. Because I'm like, if it's never happened about my electrochemical circuitry that's setting that in motion. And so that's not very responsible for me to not understand what it is that I'm bringing. The kind of trauma work that I learned is from Peter Levine, who happens to live in San Diego, where I also live, and happens to also be a Rolfer, which is one of my lineages. And his work had a lot to do with watching animals, predator-prey relationships. So in our class, we watched a wolf and a rabbit scenario. And as we were watching it, the lights were down, and I was just rooting for that rabbit. Like, I was just like, get away, like the wolf's coming, what are you doing? Like, every part of me was like, rabbit, get away, leave. And so, the hunt happens. In that case, what happened, wolf approached the rabbit collapsed. In English, we call that playing dead. And then out of the collapse, started to come to, opened its eyes. First of all, minimal movement, just looks around. Then start next amount of movement. Then its ears starts all over again. It starts just moving its eyes. Then it orients, and then it shakes all of the energy that it couldn't use to fight or to flee, just exits the body, and then eventually it's off. I watched that whole thing. Teacher said, and these were people that I already knew because I'd been in school with them for a couple of years. The teacher said, okay, who here relates to the wolf? And immediately in my mind, I was like, what freaking psychopath would relate to the wolf? And 30% of the people's hands went up. And I looked around and I was like, oh, okay. I can't dislike these people because I know them. And and then who relates with the rabbit? 70%. I thought everybody would relate with the rabbit. And in that moment, I had a major aha with all of these things connected to the rabbit. So I was a vegetarian because I didn't want to harm anything. And I was an activist, and I love underdog movies. I still do, but like, I love the movies like The Hurricane, where like the boxer's like wrongly accused, and then the people come in as lawyers and they fight for the person who's on death row. Like, I love that. I mean, it was just down the line, like all of these ways that I identified with the prey. and 0 ways that I identified with the predator. And as a human, in a human mammalian body, to be fully intact, we need the full spectrum between predator and prey. And if we have predator, which is healthy aggression, it doesn't mean we go around stalking and hunting all the time. It means we have intact protective gestures, and it also means that we can see what we want and we can go towards it without distraction and without being taken off track. So I started a journey in many different ways, in my mothering, in my relationships, and then in the healing space of how do I develop these predator, we could call it hunter, huntress characteristics. Because I also realized that in North American culture, and I think broadly as well, there's an idea that predator equals bad and prey equals good. And predators are mostly men, so predator equals men equals bad, and prey is mostly women, so prey equals women equals good. And how do we unplug that? And the other fracturing moment that came was, I'm a single mom, and I had a 5-year-old daughter at the time. Now she's 17. And I was with a group of friends, and my daughter I think she wanted sushi, and like the 4 adults wanted pizza or something like that. I thought the other adults would say their preference and overtake her, but they just were like, she got her way. So afterwards, my friend called me up and said, you're raising a really authoritarian child and you've got to get a handle on this, which was devastating. I was so pissed at my friend, but I knew I knew she was a little bit right. Like I knew she wouldn't, it was too hard to make that. Like who does, I mean, she's not doing it to hurt me. She's doing it to try to help me. So I had to take it in, even though I was so mad at her at the same time. So I went to my somatic experiencing practitioner at the time, who is a man. His name is Eduardo. He lives in Rio de Janeiro, which is where I lived at the time. And I brought this to him, and I had chosen him specifically because I realized my whole life when I was in therapy, it was always women. And when I went back to that seed, I was like, oh, because when I was 15, my parents sent me to therapy once, and it was with a male therapist who actually now has his license taken away. So he creeped me out. But at the time, I didn't know why, but I was just like, I don't want to do that. So when I was in Rio and I was realizing, oh, there's something deeply afraid in me about men, and it's influencing my relationships unconsciously. I'm like, I need to get a male practitioner. So I chose somebody that was really big. He's a martial artist, he's a dancer, and he had physicality like somebody who had crossed boundaries with me before. So I was like, I want to encounter that in a space. So I went to him and I said, I was feeling really sorry for myself. And honestly, I think I had a little bit of reason to feel sorry for myself because it was really, really hard what I was up against, like living in another country, in another language, with a father that was actually sabotaging more than anything else. And so I said to him, I gave him the situation and I said, I'm so tired. I'm so tired of being the unconditional love and the discipline at the same time. And he looked at me and he said, did you know that I'm from the Amazon? And I was like, no. I mean, he didn't look like someone I thought someone from the Amazon would look like. So I said no. And he said, Você uma onça. That means you're a jaguar. And I was like looking at him like, what are you talking about? He's not a shamanic type. This wasn't like a spirit animal thing. He said, you're a jaguar. And he said, look at you. You have golden skin and you're spotted because of my freckles. And he said, it's the females that teach the cubs to hunt. As onças que ensina as oncinhas caçar. And so he just fractured this in me of this mom, dad, discipline, He's like, it's the females that do this. And then he gave me as homework to go home and to watch jaguars with their cubs and to enact what I was seeing, which was a lot of wrestling and a lot of domination, lay on top, they get away, bat them around, show them physical domination. And so I did that. And whenever I did it, my daughter would actually tell me, I feel so relaxed right now. And so this idea of like parenting is democratic and everybody gets their own say, and if she wants sushi, then like, let's hear what she has to say, just got completely upended by this mammalian knowing. And so that together with some other experiences, I've been talking for a while, so I'll stop, but I could give you other examples as well. But what I did was develop a way for taking people who are over identified with the prey, which women are, and there's a lot of reasons, many women, not all of them, many reasons why, that have to do with connective tissue that are actually physiological. It's not just psychological or cultural. And then there's reinforcement culturally and psychologically often, and how to take them to restore the full spectrum of response, so they're not just a default in one of the, freeze or flight responses, or fawning, which is another default response.
I love listening to you, Kim. So you could go on for longer, and thank you for sharing these specific examples of your own life, which really, I think, convey the point. Let me make a side note, which may sound like irrelevant here, but I didn't know that that was like this I call it mobility gradient, this activation of the animal. But you see, I studied this many years ago in fruit flies, literally that, with an Israeli zoologist called Ilan Golani, who had looked at animals in zoos for a long time, and he's the person I've met that knew the most about how to watch animals and learn from what they're doing. And we studied that precise phenomenon, like the building and unmounting or unbuilding of movement in rodents and fruit flies, and now you connected it with something that brings us back to humans. So it's fascinating.
Wait, what do you mean? I don't get it. What do you mean
Oh,
about this?
look, he had, well, this is a side note because I want to come back to something perhaps more important, but all of a sudden it's like, wow, he had this, no, it wasn't a theory. He had this view, perspective on animal behavior, which wasn't genetic. It's not like the genes explain what they do,
Oh,
or even, so it wasn't genetic, it wasn't phylogenetic, it wasn't, but all those elements are there, of course, to what species you belong. And of course, it wasn't necessarily neural. It's all in the brain. So it's all about the brain, it's all about the genes, it's all about the species. He had a very dynamic view of behavior, and kind of in a dancing way. In fact, he was annotating animal behavior. Now you can do it with artificial intelligence and with a click. But he was watching hours of those behaviors and using a movement notation invented for dancers in Israel to describe the movement of pairs of wolves in Canada. He studied many different species. And his view of behavior was development, was like morphogenesis. Like when you have a limb formed or a leaf, the form of a leaf. So behavior was animated morphology. And so in his view, he was studying how animals, not simply what you would do in labs, which is you switch on and off behaviors, again, with genes or neurons, but more like let the animal unfold and infold their movement, and a way to kind of dial this slowly as opposed to snap it with super cool techniques we have in neuroscience today with optogenetics and light. He would do it in this very animal-centric way and study how pups start to move when they're put in a it's a laboratory-like experiment where you take the pup and you put it on a flat surface, and then he would study how the movement starts first with rotation and the body, and then it starts, translation kicks in. It's like a melody, and then we were making these plots where you could quantify these degrees of freedom quite mathematically and show that there is like a bone, like first this grows here and then this separates, and then so is this idea, this 19th, I mean, I could talk hours about it, but I don't want to. Is this 19th century idea of development? Like before, it was all about the genes. The guys that were studying embryology and development, that's how they would look at behavior, right? And to also create these mobility gradients, as he would call it, you could do some harsh perturbation, because one would be a newborn, but another one would be with substances. So he would give, I mean, this is things that people do in labs. He would give cocaine or weird substances to animals, and we also did it with fruit flies. So basically, we could see how the animal would shut down, rotating, and then when it would wake up, it would do exactly as you were describing, like the coming back into movement. When you observe it in this developmental sequence, had this aspects, which is fascinating because then you spoke about the mammalian, that's the mammal that's in us, and how we may inhabit one part of
The
that
mammal that
greater.
we are. It's not just in us, it's just we
Well,
are
yeah,
the mammal.
yes, and I wanted to ask you with respect to that, and we need to talk more about the mammal that we are, but what about the human that we are? Because aren't we mammalian plus somehow? What's that plus, if anything?
I don't know, but I'll come back to that. But one thing I did want to say is that the movement that you were describing and the morphology that you were describing, one of the things I think I've learned in the past couple of years that maybe I didn't know before that is, especially in being in more intergenerational rooms, because I've been lucky to be in spaces now where there's like 18-year-olds and 75-year-olds at the same time, usually mostly women, is loosening, because I don't know, but it sounds like to me this is about the individual DNA and it's about one person's DNA. And when we're talking about the dynamic relationship between predator and prey, we're talking about collective nervous systems, because there are, if you study wolves and antelope or something like that, there's an agreement that's made between the predator and the prey, and oftentimes that meeting is for the good of the whole. It's not just that wolf is hunting for itself or its own thing. It's actually caring for the whole environment. And I've seen it so much that we think that everyone's fixated because it's normal, you're in pain, so you want your own nervous system, you want to feel better, so you want to figure out how to heal your own trauma, you want to figure out how to not be depressed, not be anxious, not be overwhelmed, all of the things that most people that come to me are feeling on some level. But what I've realized is, like, let's just take birth for instance. Yes, we need healthy aggression during birth. My second book, Call of the Wild, is pretty much about how to help women move towards healthy aggression. And most women, even hearing healthy and aggression together, fractures our circuitry. Like, is that even possible? Is it possible to be healthily aggressed? Why would I want to do that? Especially if I've been the prey a lot of times, the last thing I would want to do is be the predator that hurt, because that's our only association with predation, is that we were on the opposite side of that. But we, in a room full of women of many different ages, you sort of realize that this development of sovereignty, we could call it, or autonomy, or a sense of self-protection and self-defense, I think that if in an animal world, that would be intact, because we would grow up if we were in bodily contact, and we weren't only relating from a verbal and cerebral place, because we've been taught now to parent like that. We've been taught that we got to talk everything out and that we need to use words all the time. We've been taught we shouldn't really use our body language to convey certain things. I mean, one thing, just a quick example, is that if you show these eye teeth, which are, you could call them canines or felines, if you show that to a dog, they'll obey. You can also do that with children. And so people in my courses start because we all have this experience where we tell our kids no like a trillion times and they don't listen and they keep asking, right? Or they keep pulling at your breast, or they keep doing this thing, and you're like, I need this to stop, but for some reason the words I'm using are not conveying what the behavior that I'm trying to get. And another way of talking about that is creating coherence between the tone of my voice, my facial expression, my body language. And if those are coherent, then almost always the behavior on the other side, whether it's children or just people out on the world, doesn't surprise you, because you're creating a coherent message in your system. So it goes beyond just wanting to feel better, although that's not a bad thing to want. It goes in when we're in these multi-generational rooms, you see, wow, if we were living tribally, we wouldn't necessarily have to occupy all of these places at the same time, because if you were a young girl, you would have a crone that was somewhere nearby that was protecting you and watching what was going on, and you would be able to be in your younger self, I've been working on a new book, and part of it is about the shadow side of each of the phases of archetypal development and the virtue. I call it the vice and the virtue. So for a maiden, for instance, a young woman, it's a sense of innocence and openness um and not really understanding the power of your sexuality. And I live with this, so I really get it, because sometimes my daughter's friends come over and I'm just looking at what they're wearing and I'm like, oh my God, because they're just bursting. I mean, it's like, it's so beautiful, but it's also like, it kind of takes your breath away. I mean, a car full of 17-year-olds is like, whoa. And then they're going like, so-and-so's looking at my breasts. I'm like, yes, because you have no clothes on. Like, they are I'm having a hard time not looking at your breasts right now, because it is astonishing. But that wouldn't be so dangerous. That wouldn't be so that they could express that more readily if there were other people that were occupying their place in the generational chain.
And but we are not, I mean, when I say we, at least that's the feeling I have. We are not living in a community. I feel so not excommunicated, but without a community. I mean, we have virtual communities and whatever, but it's really hard to even have grandparents around, or uncles and aunts giving a hand, not to say a group of friends that is more than the friends I used to hang up with, and so on. And so that's all very nice, but how do we live where there's really no community around?
Well, most of us are doing it. So it's happening. And you asked before, like, what's the difference between the mammal and the human part? I personally think we're at like a developmental branch of Homo sapiens, where there's going to be the group that goes towards mammalian and there's going to be the group that goes towards AI, because AI, plastic surgery, filters on social media, it's all kind of congealing into the same thing. Like this very minute, this could be me not even talking. This could be like some freaking video of me with earlier things that I've said that are getting
Yeah,
conglomerated, and
yeah.
we're pretending to have a conversation. Um, so I really see this choice point of, and I'm seeing it in my daughter and a lot of her friends, where they're like really deciding, okay, I want to, do I believe in college? Um, do I need to be self-sustaining? So do I need to learn these like survival skills? Is that something that's more important than going to college, for instance? And really thinking, and if X catastrophe happens, will I know how to live in
Yeah.
that circumstance?
One option sounds kind of forward towards the abyss, like the transhumanist, but the second one, and I've never heard anyone putting it in this way, like AI or back to mammals, sounds a way backwards. How is there a way to phrase this that it sounds as if we are evolving, as opposed to saying, well, let's just go back to being proper animals as opposed to future humans, in
Well, we
merging
already are
with the
animals. That's
machines.
the thing. But the problem is that most people don't recognize that we're animals. We already are, so we don't have to go back to anything. We just have to recognize that what we're communicating most of the time is not coming from here. We think it is, but it's not. We're giant nervous systems that are communicating with one another more than anything. Um, I mean, I was at a ceremony, something ceremonial recently, and the person was calling in the direction. So this is something that Native people in North America, or in North America, often do: call in the West, call in the East. And they added in AI. So they said, thank you to the condor, and thank you to this, and thank you to AI. And I guess some people feel that this is something to be included and incorporated and not something to push against. And I think that's also when people are like, well, it's bigger than me anyway, and it's going to take over whether I resist it or not, so I better get on board. I personally, I mean, I'm 50, so I'm also like, I have the friends of mine that are younger than me are, I think, more willing to, actually, I think the millennials are more willing to adapt. I'm really seeing with my daughter and her friends that they're digging their heels in a lot more. Like, no, we don't want this. And they actually, the poor millennials, this like her generation is actually like dissing the millennials all the time. Like, oh, those millennials are always on their phones, the millennials, da 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 da. So uh I don't know. I don't see progress as something that's inherently good, but I don't see thinking that prioritizing my animal body is somehow regressive. Like, I'm not talking about going back to live in a cave or something. Although maybe that, who knows? Like, I don't know if that's going to be required at some point. It's hard to say. I don't pretend to I mean, I've read some about, like, I've read Jamie Wheel's Recapture the Rapture. I've read some things of people that really feel that, like, doom is impending and um the apocalypse is, like, basically upon us. I didn't grow up evangelical, and I don't keep up so much with every single part of how climate is working and all that kind of stuff. But I personally don't think it's a regression, because I wouldn't know what we were regressing to.
Yeah.
I just I just know what being on a screen 8 hours a day does to my nervous system and to my brain. And I can feel that because I lived at a time when it wasn't that way. And that's not the direction that I would hope for my child or the next generation.
Yeah, no, I agree, and thank you for putting it in its proper place. I'm not repudiating the animal in me. Maybe another way to put it is, I feel that we humans are is kind of a vector between animal and godlike, and so I wonder where's the spiritual aspect
I think
in
the animal is, I don't think it's separate. I don't think the animal is less godlike. I think that's a false dichotomy between intellect and body, and, like, oh, it's like an inheritance that we have, where spirit is out there and up there and pure and white, and earth is kind of messy and dirty, and then the female body is actually negative, automatically negative, because we're messier, bloodier, more chaotic, more volatile. So I mean, I've been interviewed by this woman, Tammy Simon, who runs the publishing house Sounds True, and she's been a spiritual Buddhist practitioner for 40 years. And in the middle of the conversation, she just said to me, I don't want to be an animal. And I was like, I'm not surprised, Tammy. Like, yeah, because if your entire worldview is to go into non-duality and to transcend because somehow this body is not good enough, tarnished, a bit of a piece of baggage to have to deal with, then of course, then yeah, I wouldn't like to be that. But I think that, as especially as a woman, and as a woman on a spiritual path, the body is, you can't ignore it. You can transcend it in certain ways, but at some point it's going to pull you back. And for
yeah.
a female spiritual path, I don't know, because I don't remember, I'm not in a male body, but for a female spiritual path, the body is the one of the most important parts of it.
Yes, yeah, thank you for that again. Yes. Can we go back to trauma, which is related, and healthy aggression? Because you've attended, helped many people. Do you see that people think of themselves as more traumatized today, or are we just a little bit more aware of what has always been going on? Like, do you see some kind of trends, and how do they
For
look
sure.
like?
I mean, social media is almost 100% responsible for it. My first book came out before Instagram was, like, really super popular, and now my second book came out in the middle of the pandemic. And I really, my first book really shifted postpartum care. It shifted hospital policy. It shifted some political stances. Uh, the book is recommended reading at Kaiser hospitals here in the US, a lot of doula trainings, things like that. So it did what it was supposed to do, which is, like, this time after birth is an important time, and it's not just like any other time. And when we actually respect it, in Ayurveda they say 42 days for 42 years. So it's that important for not only women's health, baby health, but family health, community health. My second book came out 2021 April, so mid-pandemic. And at that time, psychology and trauma language is already part of common parlance. So people say all the time, "Oh my God, I'm so fight or flight," or "That's so traumatizing." I hear my daughter's friends say that, and it's not what they mean. They mean it's stressful, they mean that it's hard, but it's not inherently traumatizing. So people have much more self-diagnostic capabilities, but that doesn't, it actually, I think in many cases works against them. So just having the language, I was hoping that this second book was really going to move something forward after Me Too, was going to give us a different language set to engage with each other and pull apart a lot of these binaries that extend in so many different directions, extend to race, it extends so, it's so vast how much these nervous system predispositions influence how we speak about things. I stopped really showing up for trauma stuff because I'm just not really interested in continually reinforcing this idea that we're all just traumatized. In the beginning, 5 years ago, that was kind of radical to say, like, well, everybody has some trauma. It's not, you're not special to have it. Like, we all have it, because being human also means having ruptures. But what it's become is that, oh, so we're all victimized now. And like life is just like, the world is so unsafe and the world is so messed up that we're all victims to that. So of course we're all traumatized. And like a lot of things, that just means that people that genuinely need the help can't really access it very well, because everybody's in that category. ADHD is a great example of that. Like, I have so many adult friends that are now like, oh, well, I'm so ADHD, I'm so this. I'm like, maybe, but maybe you also are just online a lot, and maybe you're also like, there's just a million things that could be contributing. Maybe you're menopausal, maybe, you have long COVID, I don't know. But the labels are just readily there to use. I also don't get invited to a lot of the trauma stuff anymore, because I speak outside of a social justice agenda, which is maybe ironic, because my undergraduate is in social policy, and I spend a lot of time as an activist in Chicago public schools. But I don't obey the laws of language when it comes to gender. So that means I don't get invited to stuff. And also, frankly, the trauma world is still majority older men, which is cool, because I stand on the shoulders of people like Peter Levine and Bessel van der Kolk. But what I recognize is, when I would go to advanced sexual abuse workshops with those people, it was so distorted, because the power dynamic is so intense, and everyone's pussyfooting around because nobody wants to offend anyone, which makes it even worse. It feels less safe because everybody's so afraid to use proper grammatical language. And at first I was very critical of it, until I went in the room with Peter and about 100 other people, and all the trauma therapists have sexual abuse and are traumatized. Like, that's why they're there. They're drawn to that for their own healing. So I'm like, okay, so this is a completely dysregulated room where there's no positive element to sexuality. Like, I think the best trauma work sexually, when it's not, of course, if it's like systemic ritual, all that, but most people have sexual boundary ruptures of some kind. One of the best things is positive reparative experience. It's education in a lighthearted, fun, and good way, because how we got to where we were often is because we didn't have the information we needed. We didn't understand what was happening at the time. So even giving the nervous system framework helps people, starting where they are now, have interactions they want to have. Go to the gynecologist and be able to communicate about what's working for them and what's not working for them during a pap smear. Being able to tell somebody yes, no, or maybe in the present day interaction. That's a lot of that can transform the past experiences, but that's not what happens in the trauma rooms generally. There's not any tools given about sexual education from here forward, or sexual interaction. It's just, it's gnarly. It's absolutely gnarly to be in a room like that. And the male teachers, they use generic language like pelvic floor, because if they were to use the anatomical language, that in and of itself is something that the audience can project onto and distort and make into something. And everything is so litigious these days, and is so, men are so afraid of being perpetrators, because they're, like, my dad won't change my niece's diaper because she's a girl. I'm like, what the hell? Like, I have a sister, like, my dad changed our diapers all the time, but he's like, I'm not doing that here. You should do it. I'm not getting in an elevator where there's just women and I'm the only men because it's just not safe for me to be. So there's all of these counter movements. So is trauma something we need to be working with? Yes. The nervous system. I mean, I would just prefer to say the nervous system because the nervous system includes the full range of human experience. And we're so spoiled as modern people that we think like death is traumatic or birth is, people say it all the time, birth is inherently traumatic. How is that possible? How is the thing that every single one of us is how we got here? How is that inherently traumatic? That makes no sense. I can see how contemporary birth is almost inherently traumatic because so much of it is medicalized, hospitalized, managed, non-mammalian, because we have no practice being mammalian. So we come to these things that are inherently visceral and animal, and we're shocked generally, because also we haven't been in a room with an animal or another person doing it. Like, I think that if every person giving birth had even been in the room, not watched on a video, but been in the room with animals giving birth, it would change a lot. But now when 10 years ago, it was like, well, women don't have any imagery about what it is to give birth. So we would watch films about it. Okay. Some of them were hilarious. Like, I watched this one that was like women giving birth with dolphins, which was actually awesome. My mom was watching it with me and she told me it was all she could do to just be like, girl, this is not how it's going to go. But I was all in on the dolphin birth and I love dolphins. So I'm like, yeah, take me to the ocean. Like, I'll just do it there. It was nothing like that. But now I open my Instagram feed and there's just babies crowning on Instagram. I'm like, that is, talk about something that maybe should not be just widely publicized. Like, I don't think we're meant to see everyone's baby crowning. I think that's it's over the top and it's not helping with birth. So if that's what people think it's doing by showing the image of it, that it's normalizing it and it's helping, it's not, because birth is getting harder for people, not easier. And that's statistically proven. Michelle O'Donnell has tons of work on that. And it's not, that's not even counting the pandemic and what pandemic did to birth, because pandemic completely changed. It's a lot of midwives quit. They couldn't make it through the pandemic. It was too intense. An already really stressful and hunted profession got even worse. So I know so many midwives who retired during the pandemic.
You're helping me a lot, Kim, to understand things. Let me ask you another abstract question, which I'm pretty sure you'll land it. Because the way you're describing the waters you're surfing, I resonate with, because you're seeking a third way, a middle way, which doesn't mean it has to be at the equidistant point between a kind of the orthodoxy, how it's always been done and taught, and the heterodoxy, which sounds cool but ultimately fails too. And in the work I'm trying to do as a scientist, I also feel I'm in this tightrope between what would be called pseudoscience or new age. Is like, don't do too much of that, and everything has its vices and its virtues. Or don't fall into scientism and be this kind of like the old paradigm of, I put on my white coat and therefore what I say is true because I'm a scientist, right? And another thing I see in you, which I see in me, and I'm forgetting that there's people listening to, because really I'm talking to you now. Like, you sound like an activist, but not an activist that goes with a flag. And I'm trying to also find what kind of an activist I am in this game, and how not to, again, fall too much on one side or on the other side, and feeling really alone in this. Because if you leave one place, you go to the other, everybody says you're welcome, but the moment you start kind of questioning, like, well, but look, this thing you're doing here, it doesn't work for me, they say, okay, then just leave our community again, because that's how we do it here. You sound as if you're integrated kind of this third way. Share something about it, please.
It's a beautiful observation. And I'm really curious about this word activism too, because I think for me it was an inherently good word. And I felt like, as somebody who grew up with a lot of privilege, that was my responsibility, was to be an activist. I also thought that when people healed their trauma, that would make them de facto an activist. I think at the end of my second book, that was my question, was from personal to collective healing. I feel like I was extremely disillusioned because I thought, oh, well, yeah, if you're underwater and you're, you can't really see above water, then of course you're not going to be an activist. Although there's a lot of underwater people who are activists because they're over-identified in the prey, and so their whole life is
Totally.
about that,
Yeah.
and they're martyring their own system
Let me just
in
say here
favor
that
of
to
that.
me, let me interrupt here to say, to
Yeah.
me, activists used to sound like wounded people protesting, right? But you're saying, well, there's another kind of activism which happens once you've healed those traumas, right?
There could be, but now these days I've been wondering, do we need more activists? Because it feels like everybody's an activist. And because
Well,
everybody's got a platform, then
yes,
everybody
exactly.
thinks their voice is
Exactly.
equally
Yes.
important. And then everybody can say anything. And I'm like, I'm not really
Yes.
sure that's what's needed now.
Yes.
So I probably sound like an activist because I just am like a really fiery, and I mean, I think I am one as well, but like I'm just, everyone always says, oh, you're so passionate, but it's just like how I am. And also I think that when I always say, if couples come to me and they want me to be their doula, they want me to be their labor support, I'm not very good at that job anymore because you're supposed to be kind of neutral. You're supposed to support them in what they want. But the thing is, they're not educated, and they don't believe you because I do sound crazy. When you talk about what birth is really like, you sound crazy to people. They're like, it couldn't be this bad. If it was this bad, it wouldn't be this way. And it's like, no, it is this bad. Ask anybody who works in this field, they will tell you it's this bad. So, I mean, for me, I had to save myself because my last hospital birth that I went to was so horrible that I was like, I can't do it anymore. Like, it's not worth it. And people would be like, oh, but the birth was so much better because you were there. I'm like, yeah, but incrementally, because it still sucked and it was horrible for me. So I don't think it's worth it. So now I will only go to home births, but I don't really get called out for that much either. So this third way, I don't know, I think it has to do with a lot of what we're talking about. Is it working? What scale is it in? You know, uh, is it me just I have a couple of apprentices, the way like my first apprentice ever, she is a hunter, a deer hunter. And so she came and sat in on 25 sessions that I did. And then she took me on a hunting trip as an exchange because I didn't want to, like, I could have some kind of pyramid training model. Like, first you've got to do this, and then you get to me, and then you can be this. And I just like, I don't want to do that. And so what feels better to me, because what I do when I'm in my office, like some people are like, oh yeah, I want to do yoni massage, I want to do this. It's like, it's an encounter with the holy every single time. And I don't approach like every single day. I'm like, okay, like I'm going in, I'm gonna do this, but it's not because I'm fascinated by it or because I get something like I'm not like into it that way. Like I had this guy tell me, he's a very well-known anatomist, and he's like, I really want to do internal pelvic floor work. And I was just like, that's so creepy. Not because he's a guy, but just his approach to it. I'm like, it's such challenging work, and it's very revelatory, and it's people will say, oh, that sounds really depressing. But actually, helping people heal from birth trauma is pretty easy because vaginal tissue is very malleable. And so scar tissue unwinds really fast and it's very responsive. So I love doing it because I can help people really fast. Things that have been hurting for 3 years, 5 years, even 20 years sometimes, I can just help them dissolve because it's the tissue together with the somatic memory in the tissue. So if you go to a PT, they're just working the biomechanical physical part. If you go to a therapist, they're just doing the emotional trauma part. If you go to a nutritionist, they're just doing the biochemical part. But I can work between those layers, and then the system resolves pretty quickly. So I love doing it because I get good results. And then also, I'm not in that ongoing relationship with someone. They just come to me, I help them fix their problem. I don't get into their like identified as a victim or a and that's not to say some people, I call it victim survivor jaguar. So there's a lot of us going around in the world thinking we're not a victim, and then at some point we realize that shit was wrong. Like that thing that happened to me was not okay, and we need to be in the victim space. We need to say it wasn't my fault, I didn't deserve that, at that time I didn't have the skills to act differently. but that's not a place to stay. And then the next place is survivor, where a lot of things you're doing are still in response to that to heal it. Or like in my case, I would speak at these big events called Take Back the Night, where you tell your story and you're heard by other people. But then Jaguar is where you go and you live your life, and you're not living your life always in relationship to that bad thing or those bad things that happen to you. That because you are in your animal self, we have a way that we metabolize that. And it doesn't mean we forget about it or it goes away. It's just that it doesn't have a grip on us like it did before. And we would be better off as a culture if more people knew how to traverse those spaces and had the support to traverse them. But unfortunately, one-on-one therapy isn't going to do it. And that's also why I changed the way I was working, because I had wait lists of hundreds of people, and I had practices in 5 cities. I had San Diego, LA, Vancouver, Chicago, and New York. And I was going between them, and all of them had super long wait lists. And people would be like, "Oh my God, that's so amazing." And I'm like, "No, it's like actually horrifying. Like, it's horrifying that this many people need this work." And so now what's my next upstream contribution? And so then I have a few apprentices and I wrote this second book. But I'm still very much like, I have a lot of ideas that I think actually would solve a lot of problems. But I am only one human body, and I'm in menopause now, and my daughter's about to graduate from high school. In these last couple of years, I just was like, I had to take a step back of what can I actually do? And I am a good business person because I learned to be, because I needed to be. But it's hard for me to straddle all of the different elements that I'm putting in motion. And uh I think my work with Stephen also put a kind of a pause in a way on certain things, so that I got a different perspective, and I'm continuing to get a different perspective. And I've also put our work as a high priority, because of the age and condition. Uh, it feels like this is the time to get as much of his work in the world out there as I can. So, um, long answer to activism and a third way. And I think part of that answer is scope. Maybe thinking always in terms of a big scope isn't, which as an American also, that we're just like trained that way, we're just like trained to think big and like we can make a difference and like it matters
Yes.
what I think and all that kind of thing. Um, I appreciate that in myself, that I have sort of an incorrigible desire to um shift something towards equity. But I also am hopefully being seasoned a little bit by my age, and like, what is it that I'm actually going to do going forward? Which of these things need to be passed off to someone else or just maybe never happen? And what am I really going to do?
Yes, we have a few more minutes before we open it up, but I wanted to add something more. Well, first, I've also experienced what sacrifice can open, like saying, well, look, I cannot do all these many projects or questions, or have a laboratory life as I'm supposed to have. I'll give that away, and then you can work on other things start happening. And that's something I'm going through right now as well. Which things am I ready to sacrifice so that other things can happen, so that I can progress. But I wanted to ask you about the certain sense of urgency. Do you do all of that? And you've sketched a little bit of also a strategic vision, right? Like one-on-one. I have a friend, a very good friend who's a therapist, and he's happy being in, as I say, in his cave, one patient in the morning, one patient in the afternoon, 6 or 7 days a week, non-stop. He's like a miner. But then there's another strategy, which is no, I won't do that. I'll write books. I'll have groups. I'll have conferences. But that's the strategic part. But do you do this with a sense of urgency? Do you think we, and again, when I say we, it's hard to be specific, but as a civilization, or just you and I, we should be in a hurry, or that doesn't help?
I modulate that in myself. I look at it from a nervous system perspective. You know, if we're always, because urgency is a fight response or a flight, it could be either one. And the flip side of a fight or a flight response is this healthy direction, healthy aggression is like knowing, staying the course, not getting pulled around by the latest news or the latest disaster unless it's impacting you. That's something, I mean, I've taken so much heat for this, but in the course of the last 5 or 6 years of my business, I've done quite a bit of crowdfunding with my platform. So like the first year of the pandemic, we raised $85,000 to open a Black-owned birth center in San Diego. And then the next year, we sent a single Black mom in Sweden to art school for a year who did the drawings for my 4th trimester journal. And then there was the fires in Hawaii last year, and I knew somebody there. And so I helped mobilize resources for her to get herbs to serve the lungs of the people in her community. But then, of course, right now we're having a natural disaster in the south of the United States. And then we have this war/genocide going on. And so I've taken a lot of flack for like, well, if you raise money for this, why aren't you raising money for that? And why aren't you doing this? And why aren't you doing that? And I'm so disappointed. People are just always so disappointed in me that I'm not, you know, doing the thing that they think is important and covering the waterfront on every possible topic. So to me, that would be more than my system could handle. And I also don't find it effective. So I'm really concerned with the efficacy of my energy as well. And I do feel urgency because I have a child. I mean, maybe if I didn't have a child, I still would. I don't know. But I mean, when some of like my daughter didn't go to school the other day because there was a school shooting threat. And they didn't really know how serious it was. And I didn't know how serious to take it. But I was also like, I don't really want to be the mom sending her kid to school the day that this actually happens when it was a threat. So, yeah, sometimes it's easy to keep these things a little bit at bay until like also all my daughter's friends are on medication. You know, like that breaks my heart. Like they're on dopamine medication because when they were 7 to 10, they used a phone too much. They're on antidepressants. They're on, you know, and so for me, who does believe in mammalian biology, I don't believe we're machines. I don't believe that the body is something where you plug and play. We're not Mr. Potato Head. You don't get to just put a little hormone in here and take a little hormone out there. It's a whole system. And so I've worked so hard on behalf of educating women about the effects of birth control on us long term on fertility. And yeah, so that I have a sense of devotion to that and dedication, but I try to modulate the urgency piece, both because there you got to have a healthy sense of humility. Like, again, one human person, one human body. That's why we're on the earth with other people who hopefully are also doing somewhat of their part. And I don't see that it makes me more effective. It makes me my kidneys hurt and makes me doubt what I'm already doing rather than just saying, well, I'm doing what I can do. And I think when I hit 50, I had like a real reckoning with myself of like, so funny I say that and then a hot flash starts right away.
Yes.
I had to look back. It gave me a different sense of time in a way that I've never really been. I've been very much of a present person or a past person, and it made me look back and say like, well, is maybe everything I've already done is just enough. And so like maybe if I didn't even do anything else, like what my work can stand. Not that I'm not going to do other things, but at a time when I felt very physically deficient and burnt out, it was like, okay, well, I've made this contribution and maybe it's part of passing the baton. And I don't know, I don't think looking at the world, a fix-it mindset is an activated nervous system. So when we come at a problem, that's why when people come to my office and they tell me what their problem is, It's like I have to get them out of I need to fix myself first, because we're never going to be able to loosen up whatever it is as long as we're approaching it from something is wrong, I have to fix it. Something is wrong. Some people argue, well, that's what you should feel in a world like we have. But that's not where generative motion happens. It can't. It's not sustainable there. You have to go towards a platform of, you have to develop a relationship with beauty and a relationship with the things that are okay and the things that are intact. Because those of us sitting here in this room, if we can hang out on a weekday and be together like this, most things are working pretty well. And it's our mind that's going out into all of this information seeking that then creates a narrative of things are not okay. Because right now in the room where I'm in, I'm safe. And if my body doesn't feel that, my nervous system is not coherent with my environment. So I'm really working with people in that present moment reality. And also because I actually do find a lot of beauty in the world. And I do feel scared sometimes because I watch, my parents are like, let's watch this David Attenborough Planet Earth that looks like it's just all going to hell like really soon. So it's hard to watch that and then also live with the present reality. But I don't want to miss out on the beauty and the love and heartbreak and grief because I'm spinning a tale in my mind about something that's so much vaster than what I can even really comprehend, honestly. But I do want to say something about the research, because I've been talking a lot about this, and I think there's a balance between research and experience. That's duh, everybody thinks that. But this knee-jerk thing that people, especially feminists, say, a lot of people in women's health are saying is like, well, not enough research is done on women, and not enough research is done on pregnancy in women, and not enough research is done on menopause. I really don't think that we need more research on that. I think common sense and horizontal wisdom intergenerationally in these cases of women's health are completely adequate. We don't need, if you research, for instance, the research on home birth versus hospital birth says that they're equally safe. So the research doesn't even give us a different starting point from where we are. I have a friend who's an evolutionary biologist, and she's been majorly on research and research on endometriosis and research on correlations between different kinds of female health things and mental health things, and very interesting. But even she's like, I'm kind of getting sick of trying to get my papers published in academia, because she can't get it published because she's not using cis and transgender language because it's questioned what is even a woman. Then she can't get it published because she's got ideas that are outside of how it's supposed to be scientifically annotated. And she's like, frankly, I'm finding a lot more interesting dialogue with people that are not trying to fit it into this model. So I'm not anti-science. I just know that with so many of the people that I work with, like, I'll just tell you one story. This woman came to me a few weeks ago. She was having horrible pain after orgasm, and it was always on one side, and it was doubling her over. She went to her gynecologist. She said, I think it's related to my cesarean scar. The gynecologist said, that's like impossible. That's just not what it is. She came to me. She literally told me exactly, not in anatomical language, but she gave me the keys exactly to the puzzle she had, which is that her psoas was spasming, a muscle that connects your 12th rib, your lumbars to your inner thigh. It was crossing through the scar tissue of her cesarean scar. And so when her uterus contracted, she was doubling over. It was like very straightforward. So I fixed it. And she was like, oh my God, you're a miracle worker. I was like, no, it makes me look like a wizard, but it's because nobody listened to you. And also, like, the doctor doesn't even usually touch you. So they didn't even like palpate to tell you what it was. They just listened and then said that's not related. Most people know what's going on. And when they're listened to and my hands give the body a witness, then the body dissolves the thing that's held up. So we don't need research for that. We need attuned listening. We need some training in hands. We need to trust that, yeah, we actually do know how our bodies work.
Amy, it's wonderful to listen to you. We'll open it up for questions. But I want to say, really, I'm very honored you've spent this time with us, and I've learned a lot. Thank you. Thank you. Let's see if there are comments or questions from the audience.
Thank you both.
too.
Yes,
everyone.
we can open it up now to the rest of the audience. You can use raise your hand function that you can find under reactions and at the bottom of your screen. Amy, please come in and join us.
Hi, thank you so much. This is just beautiful to listen to you. Incredible. This is my grandson, Silas, and my daughter's been a student of yours for 5 years. And Silas was born right here in the apartment in a free birth with her dad and with his dad and his mom and her sister. And that was the most incredible experience for her ever. And it is from, listening to you. I learned so much from what you just spoke about. And thank you for giving me that jaguar image of prey and predator. That totally shifted a huge thing in me. I just want to thank you so much. And this is Silas.
What's your daughter's name?
My daughter's name is Corinne Olson, and she's in the other room. She's a child therapist and a birth advocate for, having a baby at home. He's just delightful. But thank you so much. I'm so glad that you got to meet this little baby that you helped bring in the world through your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Ali, please come in.
Here we go.
Yeah. Okay.
Wow, it's so nice to see this combination of the Parry Center and the history of the double slit. While you come from this amazing tradition of birthing at the human level. And I just wanted to, first of all, thank you for the ways in which the dialogue brought forward some of the less well understood connections that I know people who are mostly thinking about things today are walking on the planet. And so what I simply wanted to put together was a few little strands of my observation. And if this story begins again now, as you in your personal story and through the more quantum field of awareness allows us to understand that the shifting ecology of we humans through this touching in and metabolizing of a collective birthing process that might be happening. So I don't know what we are. It could be something beyond our understanding now. And isn't it nice to know that there's a space at this day that you bring your personal history and stories into the Parry Center groupings, so that if it's true that there is a direction that we're heading into, that we can blend it without judgment. And that's what I'm getting from the way in which you speak, that it might be over what you used to do and something is still happening. And so that space of the in-between, which is really the magic of kind of an auto-poetic systems change process that I live from, that we don't have to know it, we just have to simply engage with it. And that embrace, just like the embrace of a mother of a newborn, is something that we can do as a collective. And so that's what I'm receiving from this conversation, some new ways in space and time to invite a dialogue that further threads and strengthens the fabric, the matrix of this new time, so that we feel safe and further engaged and motivated to continue in whatever form it does come forward in. So that's kind of how I receive your groundedness, and that bringing in the academics. Fredrickson talks about this, Barbara Fredrickson, in the thriving after surviving, and then this flourishing. So it feels like we're actually inhabiting a place of flourishing here in this conversation. And that feels new and a little wobbly, but isn't that what it's all about when we learn again? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ali. Manfred, would you like to come in?
No. Thank you so much, both of you. It was, in a way, deeply touching to find people who are looking for a third way, not staying on one side or the other side, and to push it or to bring it out. And the third way, as I understood it for you, it's not a fixed way. It's an open way. So this way develops itself under our feet. And that means it's openness, what is important. Because in my view, everyone has a different way to look at the world. And when I take this serious, any contact with any different meaning means an enrichment. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you.
I don't know if either of you would like to comment on any of the questions that were asked or the comments that came in.
I just want to say thank you to the elders who are here. I guess I see myself in this situation kind of like a messenger, because also some of these worlds, like the birth world, for instance, it's very siloed. So most of the time, the people who know something about birth are the people who are really close to having had children themselves. I've even talked with people who work in hospitals, like pharmacists, and they don't know what's happening on the labor and delivery floor in their hospital, and they don't know how much has changed over the decades and how birth goes. So I think of it as a real privilege to be able to be amongst people that might be in different phases of life or are in different phases of life. And I saw that Jackie said she grew up at a time when not so much was expected of us. And I get that sense sometimes that when I think about my own mom, who was a homemaker, and she didn't have a community or a village, but she also didn't know that she needed one. So she wasn't living in this kind of purgatory that my generation and the next generation live, which is I'm doing this thing, and I also know that I'm doing it out of the context that would be the most life enhancing. And so it's good to have that knowledge, but it also makes us be in a purgatory that is hard. It's a bind of the nervous system, that even though my mom was raising 3 kids and my dad was traveling a lot, and I'm not glorifying that, I'm sure that I know it was hard in a lot of different ways. It wasn't hard because she didn't think it was supposed to be some other way. She didn't think it was supposed to be easier. She didn't think she was supposed to be doing something else, or that it wasn't valuable what she was doing. So I'm really grateful to be in this is an unusual setting for me, and to be among a different group of people who maybe didn't automatically have interest in these topics, because I think sex and birth and trauma nowadays is out there in the world quite a lot. I mean, at least, yeah, I mean, I see it on magazine covers and things like that. But as far as sex and birth, when I went into the trauma healing world, I realized, wow, these female experiences, sex is an all gender experience, but these female experiences, they're if we were going to talk about ruptures, almost everybody has had a rupture when it comes to their gynecology or sexuality. And then we have all of these things called complex PTSD, but those are not counted in it. So we talk about veterans and we talk about all these other ways of complex PTSD. But if we were to include the female experience, then the definition would just be so broad. And that's probably why it's not included, because it would include most everyone, which to me means it's a cultural edict. It's not an individual edict, which is why having us gather here and even having heard this conversation means we can move forward differently, knowing what some people are contending with. And I had one experience where I had never known much about prostitution or sex work. I had some stereotypes about it informed by film, I think. And then when I went to sexological bodywork school, a lot of the other students were sex workers of different kinds. Some of them were street workers, some of them worked in brothels, some of them were escorts. And I had a really hard conversation because I was the only person not a sex worker, and it was really upsetting to me, some of the stories they were telling. And they totally understood and were like, yeah, we kind of went into shop talk and we get it, how that would be really overwhelming for someone who doesn't do this work. And I have lots of questions about it. I don't think it's inherently feminist to disagree with sex work, and I don't think it's inherently feminist to say, yeah, sex work is great. Same with pornography. I don't have like, I'm anti-porn or pro-porn. I had to ask myself, if I'm pro-sex work, then am I okay if my daughter chooses this as a profession? And the answer to that is absolutely not. So, there's a lot of layers to the conversation. But I went to my office the next day and I had 3 clients, and they were all clients that I had seen before, 1 man and 2 women. And the man disclosed to me that his first sexual experience was with a sex worker and that he often paid for sex, and he had never told me that before. And then the other 2 women both told me experiences of times that they had been paid for sex, and they were really ashamed and they had never brought it up before. And that showed me that just me being in that conversation and hearing it and reckoning with it opened me up to be able to hear another person's story and hold their grief with them in a way that I wasn't able to, because I had a judgment and an unconscious one at that prior to that. So I guess that would be my wish, is that just through hearing about these things, even if they don't touch you directly, maybe they do touch you more directly than you know, but on a subterranean level.
Yes. Let me add to this, maybe in closing, unless somebody has something to add or bring to the table, that as you know, I love books and I read and I try to grasp the ideas, because my training is rather abstract as a physicist. But lately I've been discovering, and conversation today with Kim, but the previous months with Amy, and before with Allison and so on, there's something very interesting, because I still love good, simple, powerful ideas, but there's something about the testimony of people like you that's more powerful than great ideas. Like I realize that I used to worship ideas. That's kind of the raw material that I shuffle and I juggle, and I still love it. But there's something about having kind of an actual embodiment of certain ideas in kind of in a human flesh, and with a history behind, and with tensions and conflicts and wounds. That sounds to me like what I've been looking for when I started the series, in terms of the future scientist, right? Like, how is the science of the future, how is it going to be made and communicated? And probably we still need recording equipment and equations, but there's something I feel every time I talk to people, not anyone, but like in this case with you, Kim, and in previous occasions, that something tremendously unique, maybe that's another way of expressing it. There's a tension between the abstract and the general, and the unique and the concrete. But hearing you talk about all these things brings both things to the table, brings all these attention to the minute particulars that terribly matter. And at the same time, I have a sense of the bigger picture. And there's also a sense of communion, because it's like, after talking to you today, it's like, I feel like I kind of love you more. It's like I got to meet you and know you better. And there's kind of a feeling of awe, even not to the ideas, to the great ideas you may have brought to, but to the person I'm talking to, and also the community here listening. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you both very much for being here today. Thank you to everybody who came to listen, and we look forward to seeing you here again at the Pari Center. Bye-bye, everybody.